In this guide, I'll be showing you a cold rapid-fire build for rogues, which I recently used to complete a tier 100 nightmare. It's designed specifically for high nightmare pushing, and will look different from other rogue guides that you may be used to seeing. For dealing damage, this build is all about burst. A cold build rogue does high damage to frozen targets due to various multiplicative bonuses against frozen enemies, but will do very little against targets that are not frozen or crowd controlled. Skills like Frigid Finesse, Mixed, Cold Imbuement, Control Glyph, and Penitent Greaves all multiply the bonuses together. A Cold Imbued Rapid Fire will always chill enemies enough to freeze them, and Frostburn Gauntlets will freeze enemies when Cold Imbuement is on cooldown. An elite enemy can be frozen twice before becoming unstoppable, and when an elite becomes unstoppable, it's best to play defensively and kite until they can be frozen again. Pushing High Nightmare as a ranged rogue is all about survival and defense. This mindset should be included both in your gear as well as playstyle. This build has defensive options wherever it can get them. The helm, chest, and legs all have defensive aspects and stats. The amulet also has an aspect to greatly buff the Darkshroud shadows. The Penitent Greaves and Frostburn Gloves also play a defensive role to slow and freeze enemies. For playstyle, you should avoid getting hit as much as possible even if it means the run will be slower. Ranged rogues aren't meant to absorb hits. When mobs become unstoppable, it's best to kite out temporarily instead of continuing to deal damage hoping for a faster run. When your Darkshroud shadows start to run out, you're dead. For the choice of skills, I'll explain why I chose each option, as the build looks a lot different from the builds that are made for clearing mid-tier nightmare dungeons and leveling. In this build, I run two generators. Puncture is the rogue's best generator, but it can only apply vulnerable when mobs are close. I use Forceful Arrow to apply vulnerable when they are outside of this range. It is also used to build combo points from range to prepare for a cold imbued rapid fire. For rogues, it is important to have at least one skill that makes you unstoppable to break crowd control. Most rogues use Shadow Step as it has a low cooldown. I recently switched to using Concealment instead once I was pushing 90 plus Nightmare. After testing both, I noticed I was dying more often shadow stepping into mobs than I did waiting for Concealment's cooldown to finish. Concealment is also a great counter to walling elites, who would otherwise cause issues for ranged rogues. I use Poison Imbuement primarily for the 15% damage reduction skill passive, which I try to apply when enemies become unstoppable. It is also helpful to slowly chip down foes, since the cold build is more for burst instead of consistent damage. For Darkshroud, the aspect on the helm automatically procs Darkshroud shadows, so it does not need to be on your skill bar to take effect. These shadows give a ton of damage reduction because of the aspect we run on the amulet. I put 2 extra skill points into Darkshroud, and I have 4 skill points from the pants I use as well. For Rapid Fire, it can be cancelled at the beginning of the animation by evading and the shots still fire. This gives you the 30% increased critical damage after evading from the skill passive for your next Rapid Fires. However, this build runs Penitent Greaves, which don't have the implicit evade cooldown reaction effect. Evade should be used mostly for defensive purposes when pushing High Nightmare with this build. It can be worth it to evade offensively for burst if you're sure you won't need it for defense. For Nightmare Dungeons, this build works best against melee enemies due to the slow from the Chilling Weight passive and Penitent Greaves. Some sigils will be almost impossible for a ranged rogue, so you will need to do some searching. Although it might not clear every dungeon on tier 90 plus, I believe that this build is one of the best options for a ranged rogue if the goal is to push High Nightmare. Although this specific build is made for High Nightmare, it can also be great for leveling and farming with a few changes. Any elite will die in a freeze due to Cold Imbuement's high burst, and you won't have to worry about the enemies becoming unstoppable because they'll already be dead. For farming, I would use Shadow Step instead of Concealment, Shadow Imbuement instead of Poison Imbuement, and Penetrating Shot instead of Forceful Arrow, but you can run whatever you enjoy to play, as many builds are great for farming. This guide was made to show a playstyle for cold build rogues wanting to push nightmare dungeons, as well as the reasoning for my gear and skill choices. I'm planning to also make another guide soon on some more general tips for tier 100 dungeons.